The President of India outlined priorities for the newly elected government in the address to the Parliament yesterday, joint sitting of both the houses. We are going to focus on the infrastructure initiatives here in this next discussion. Vinayak Chaterjee is joining us right now, Chairman Feedback Infrastructure Services, to tell us what he made of the speech and specifically the focus on infrastructure. Mr. Chaterjee, thanks very much for your time. Good to have you with us here. Prashant, this side. Are you enthused by,
Thank you very much.
after listening to the speech?
It's a pleasure.
After listening to the speech, because there was a lot of infrastructure-related comments which were made, specific sectors which found mention in the speech yesterday. Your first broad thoughts, sir, and then we'll dig deeper.
Okay, the first broad thought is that I suppose I'm one of the few people who read their infrastructure chapters in the manifesto very, very carefully. So I find much of it is actually, in a sense, reproduced from what was already written in the BJP manifesto. You know, high-speed rail networks, 100 new cities, etc., etc. Most of the points mentioned there, including water resources, river linking, are all the large portions of the infrastructure focus in the President's address have been lifted from the BJP manifesto, which is fine. What really caught my attention in the President's speech was the fact that I think the government, the NDA, has shown great maturity in actually adding a point, which is operationalizing the international nuclear civil program, or the civil nuclear program, which, if you recall, was one of the landmark initiatives of Dr. Manmohan Singh, where he had personally staked his reputation and his future. The fact that I have always advocated, the fact that that was a good program for India, which allowed us to use nuclear power for nuclear technologies for power and other related uses. The fact that in the President's address it found mention and the government says that it's going to take it forward, I found that a very mature move. But over to you.
Right. Just one question. You said a lot of what was put out yesterday was lifted from the manifesto. I guess it's a good thing, right? Party, I mean, you know, they campaigned on that. They put out the manifesto. They are in power and they're implementing what they said they will. Yeah.
Agreed. So I didn't say that in any sense, in any negative sense, but to say that the items that featured in the manifesto have been reiterated in the and emphasized in the President's speech, which is most welcome. And the only thing that extra that caught my attention was the civil nuclear, that the government's intention to move ahead with the civil nuclear program, which is very, very good.
Right. I mean, I think that you know what's been covered in the media, press, etc. That civil nuclear program, I think that kind of has gotten missed out, right? I don't think it's gotten that much play or emphasis or focus.
Yeah, I found that, quite honestly, I found that a little strange, because if there was one hot button that certainly caught the attention of infra watchers like us, it is, you know, there was so much debate and discussion and even opposition to the civil nuclear program, which with large portions of civil society and political society and think tanks divided on the issue. And the fact that in the President's speech the government reiterates its position to go ahead, I thought was an extremely mature and thoughtful move. And I honestly appreciate that, because it's good for the country. We need energy security.
Right. And infra watchers like you, I guess, will also track every move now, right? How does this plan get executed? The first step in that, I guess, would be the budget, which should throw up some indications. What would you like to see there from an infrastructure perspective, infrastructure initiatives perspective? We'll get to the funding and where the money will come from in a bit. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, see, in the budget, one of the major items from the infrastructure sector is actually to remove the MAT, minimum alternate tax, because when you give a 10-year tax holiday to boost a sector, it seems irrational and illogical to superimpose a minimum alternate tax there. That's one of the major demands. The other demands in the budget are, of course, in a sense, more policy oriented, which is to review the entire system by which commercial banks lend to the infrastructure sector. And I think the infrastructure sector is quite enthusiastic about seeing in the budget an announcement that commercial banks may be allowed to lend for 25 years, which means you can put forward a loan application for 25 years with 5-yearly resets, which is popularly being called the 5 by 25 model right now. The infrastructure sector is also keen to see that group exposure limits are not imposed on those SPVs where the loan is with recourse to the SPV financing. I don't want to get into detail, but if you have financed a road project, then you have done so on the security of the tolls that are being collected. If that is so, then why add this project to group exposure? Because it has nothing to do with group exposure. It has to do with future toll collections. So these are kind of some of the things that we're looking for from the budget.
Right. This group exposure point, how critical is this for large corporates?
Well, it's very critical because most corporates who had taken, as you know, the corporate sector had taken a fair degree of loans from the banking sector for implementing infra projects. So most of the corporates have hit their group exposure limits. Now, group exposure limits are fine when you're pledging the group's balance sheet. But in this case, it is what is called non-recourse financing, which means that the loan is given based only on the projected cash inflows of that specific SPV. And if that be the case, then what is the logic for including it in group exposure? So, and I think the Finance Ministry, the Department of Banking and Financial Services, as well as the RBI, I am led to believe that they are favorably considering both these points, which is the 25-year for commercial banks to lend for 25 years with 5-year resets, as well as potentially removing the group exposure limits, which will also prevent a lot of loans being called restructured and stressed and all that kind of stuff. So, and the minimum alternate tax. These are the three things that we are certainly looking forward to.
Right. No, I'll come to the point about the 25-year loan in just a bit. But just to stick with this group exposure point, you're saying it would prevent a lot of loans from from being restructured, etc. What would cause them not to be called restructured? These longer tenure loans or the group exposure norms being relaxed?
Okay, let me explain this. Okay, let me just explain to you the financial fundamentals behind this move, which is that the government in its wisdom allows a concession agreement to be signed for, let us say, 30 years for an airport or a port or whatever project, or 20 years for a road project, right? So that defines the economic life cycle of the project through which an investor can invest and recoup his investment, right? So let us say we have a 25-year concession agreement. Now, if one arm of the government thinks that 25 years is a logical economic life cycle for a person to invest and get his money back, then it is only logical that you should have 25 years horizon to be able to service your loan, to repay the capital, the principal, as well as the interest. But today we have a peculiar situation where the private sector is not allowed to apply for a loan which is more than 10 years. Now, there is therefore an illogical mismatch between the economic life cycle of a project and the loan cycle of that project. It is elementary. Any first-year student of finance will tell you that there is a huge degree of irrationality and illogic in this, and therefore the entire loan servicing has to be squeezed in 6 years, because you apply for a 10-year loan. The first 3-4 years, the project settles down, reaches maturity, and then it reaches an element of generating cash surpluses. So, in a 20 or a 25-year project today, you are pushed into a situation where you have to completely service the loan in the first 10 years of commercial operations. And it is this stress that makes loans go bad, and then you have this whole negative cycle of stressed assets and restructurings and CDRs, because the fundamental premise is based on an irrational structure. So we are trying to make it logical. We are trying to ask the government to make it logical by saying, have a loan structure which is in consonance with the economic life cycle, and this argument about asset liability mismatch of commercial banks is a bit of a hogwash, because once you even give a cash credit limit against debtors or against stocks, which is called a working capital limit, very few banks actually recall the money after 1 year. Tata Steel, for example, I'm told, have existed with their working capital limits for 100 years. So what's the big deal about an asset liability mismatch so far as infra lending is concerned? So many of these traditional thoughts have to be turned on their heads, and a new structure evolved that makes infrastructure financing far more logical, rational and investor friendly. But let me stop here.
Yeah, no, I'll come back to you, I think, but some very good points and great to hear that explanation from you. Mr. Chaterjee, just hold on. Kiran Majumdar Shaw, CMD at Biocon India Limited, is also joining us from Bangalore, somebody who talks to the government regularly, who's been a vocal supporter of this new regime, and somebody who the government listens to keenly as well. Ma'am, it's a pleasure to have you. Good morning, Prashant here. I trust you heard some of what Vinayak was talking about, the need for longer tenure infrastructure loans and how that will help, and the government is seriously considering. You've been there talking to the finance minister, you're part of the pre-budget consultations. Yesterday we heard it from the president outlining the Modi government's economic agenda. What are your first impressions, ma'am? To me it looked like this government really understands the big mandate it has got. It understands the relevance and the importance of the mandate it has got. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think, the presidential address was extremely compelling. I think it gave the right signals. But like Vinayak said, I think what we need to do is to really undo a lot of the irrational and ambiguous kind of policies that we have rolled out, and really make sure that we address what is it that is holding back growth and investment. Now, for instance, he did talk about, the long-term lending, which I completely agree with him. For infrastructure, that is the need of the hour. But equally, when you look at sectors like the pharma sector, where, manufacturing is a huge opportunity for India, because even though today this particular sector is already a $15 billion sector, we have $10 billion worth of exports, this can easily become a $25 billion opportunity in the next 10 years and a $50 billion opportunity in the next 20 years. But for all this to happen, we must understand that, again, the pharma manufacturing sector is a very capital intensive sector. We cannot have short-term lending. This has to again go down the same path of infra lending that Vinayak talked about. Secondly, I also agree with him. We have created SEZs on the promise of tax holidays, and then we, impose MAT, which doesn't make sense. We have exports in the pharma biotech sector which attract service tax. This doesn't make sense either, because the interpretation is that service is being provided locally, even though it is to cater to export needs of clients. But yet, because the service is being provided locally, they are taxing these kind of export services. This is ridiculous. There are too many anomalies in these policy rollouts, and we need to see all these corrected. I think, I just want to say that the biggest challenge is going to be the shift in mindset and attitude of the implementers of our policy. The policies are great. The policies are going to be well thought out. And I'm sure they're going to get a lot of stakeholder consultations before they really roll out the final policies. But I think the success of all these policies depends on implementation, as we all know. And we have failed miserably so far because there has been no mindset or can-do attitude or the need to do time-bound implementation. This is what needs to change.
Ma'am, before I get to what are the... So, I absolutely agree, man. To create the number of jobs, and some estimates say some 20 million new people are entering the job market. So, jobs has to be the number one priority. The only sector which can do it at that scale is manufacturing, and that has been stagnant for decades now, right? So, that has to be done. I'll get to that specific point in a bit. And infrastructure. But as somebody who's looked at this government closely, who's interacted with the last government, how different is this government from the previous governments that you've seen in how it is, how the kind of people who are running ministries themselves? You mentioned a bit about attitude. The general perception is the cabinet in that sense is largely irrelevant. Power is going to be concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, right? The top 6 or 7 civil servants will run policy, ministries will implement. That's the perception. And that could be good news. I mean, nothing wrong in that sense. But I want your sense. How do you see it? How different is this in terms of the composition and hence the working and execution?
See, these are early days yet. I've just had the opportunity to meet with a few of the ministers. But the general feeling I got is that there's a can-do attitude, there is a want-to-do attitude, and they want to do it fast. So I think, knowing Mr. Modi's track record in Gujarat and his commitment to time-bound implementation, I think things will happen in a way which is very different to what it was in the UPA government, where people were not in a hurry, people were not really focused on delivery. There were too many reasons for why things couldn't be done. I think that I'm seeing is not the case this time around, but it's early days yet. I think we must make sure that we give time to the government to basically implement some of the near-term opportunities. But I think once they start signaling that they are beginning to do things, then I think it will give us a lot more clarity in terms of how big the impact could be.